Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's now 1 o'clock, so we will get underway. I will just hand you over to Democratic Services for some housekeeping.
Thank you, Chairman. For the members of the public, please be aware that this meeting is being audio recorded and may also be filmed live for live or subsequent broadcast by members of the public or representatives of the media. Please note that the Chairman does have absolute discretion to order that audio recording and filming is suspended or terminated if, in his opinion, continuing to do so will prejudice proceedings of the meeting. Please also note that this meeting is to be audio recorded by the Council and will be published on Council's website in due course. One final note, if you have your mobile phone with you, please do switch it off or to silent so as not to disturb proceedings. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any substitute members?
Yes, Chairman. To cover item 1 is apologies, and we have apologies from Councillors Simon Bull, Councillors Drew Mellor and Tony Trent. Moving on to substitute members, we have Councillor Lisa Northover substituting for Councillor Simon Bull. Declarations of interest, can I ask that members indicate if they have any now? Chairman, that appears to be no declarations of interest. Confirmation of minutes. Could I ask, Chairman, that you are content that the minutes of the previous 2 meetings, the 13th of June 2019 and the 27th of June 2019, be signed off as a correct record? Thank you. Public issues. These will be dealt with during each application and will be heard as each relevant item is being discussed. Which brings us to item 6, schedule of planning applications. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just to let everybody know, at the beginning of the meeting, item D has been withdrawn, so we will not be discussing that today. So we will move on to the item C, which is going to be the first one we're looking at today, 58 Charminster Avenue.
Chairman, before Julia's case officer presents that application to the committee, can I just draw your attention to a further representation that's been received as of yesterday, therefore not on the addendum sheet that was circulated yesterday. Chairman, the representation is a document which has already been on the public record as a representation since the 5th of October last year. It raises nothing new, it is merely that document. It's based on drawings that have long since been superseded and therefore errs in fact in terms of the application before you today. It would slightly mislead the committee if that were to be circulated now. The only addition to it from the document that's already a matter of public record is a couple of additional photographs that have been added from the earlier submission. And Chairman, these have been incorporated into the case officer's presentation so that members will have an opportunity to see the new information that's attached to that representation. Thank you, Chair.
Is the committee happy to proceed?
Great.
Okay, brilliant. I'll hand over to the planning officer.
So this application relates to a site at 58 Charminster Avenue. The site historically was in use as commercial premises at ground floor, last used as an optician's with residential above. You'll see from the aerial photograph it has hard surfaced area at the frontage with a small garden to the rear. The proposal is to alter and convert the premises to and with extensions to form 5 residential flats. The proposed flats are all 1-bedroom units. 5 parking spaces are proposed, which would be unallocated and meets our supplementary planning document regarding parking. Here's some aerial photos just to give you an idea of what it's like there. You'll see that surrounding properties are generally 2-storey with hipped roof forms. A number of them have bay features. This is the property There are 2 highway trees to the frontage. The proposed parking would be via an entrance through those trees. The highway tree officer was consulted during the process of this application and is satisfied that, subject to a condition protecting the trees during the construction process, there would be no harm to the trees with the location of the access. I'll come back to some of these photos in a second. So this is the site plan. You can see it's not working. So this would be a 2-storey element at the rear here, with single storey here. There's a bin store and a cycle store at the rear of the property, with a communal garden area for the residents of the flats. The blue line indicates the existing building, so you can see that the application proposed is fairly similar in scale to the existing building. It incorporates bay features which are characteristic in the area. If I go back to the photos, we've had representations from one of the neighbours who was concerned about impact on his property. Having visited the property, I myself agreed that I was concerned about impact on this window, which is a primary window to the kitchen. There are upper floor windows which would be affected by the development, but these serve bathrooms and a landing which are not considered to be primary rooms. As a result of visiting the site, the plans have been amended. So if I take you, this plan shows here clearly the 2-storey element, and that's the window that's in question. So the architect has amended the plans to draw the 2-storey element so that it's beyond the window, so that this keeps a fairly open aspect here. This would be a single-storey building with a sloped roof, so it'd be sloping away from the window, allowing a good light into the window. Other concerns have been raised by the neighbour here about the location of the bin store being close to her property. The bin store would be enclosed with doors opening out this way. It's not unusual to have bins at the sides of properties next to neighbouring properties. This has been considered. We don't think that there is an issue with that. And these are the photos that were submitted by the neighbouring resident. They're just photos showing the street scene and parking. I think he will be talking about it in his deputation, so I will obviously go back to those at that point, but just to say that they're there really. Thank you.
If members of the public that wish to speak on objection of this are here, Roy Coleman, Amanda Pike, they would like to come up to the... And you have 5 minutes between you.
As you've seen, the bin store is on the boundary to my property. On Tuesday we met the planning officer and I asked for the bin store and the cycle store to be swapped. She said she couldn't do this because smell would issue into the amenity space of the development.
Sorry, we're just going to double check if the microphone's on. I'm going to pause the...
Thanks. Shall I start again?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So you've seen where the bin store is. It's now been moved to my boundary. On Tuesday we met with the planning officer and I asked for the bin store and the cycle store to be swapped. I've been told by the planning officer that she can't do this because it would issue smell into the amenity space of the development. In the current situation, the smell will be issued into my lounge and bedroom windows, and my kitchen window is 2.4 metres from the front of my house. I don't understand or agree with the planning officer's comments, and I ask you to swap the cycle and bin stores. It would be at no extra cost to the developer. There are many concerned residents here today. I'd like to state that no one is against the development of this site. The concerns are with regards to the size and the shape of the development and its impact on others, be it light, smell or traffic. Small changes could resolve these issues easily. On Tuesday, we had the opportunity of viewing the line of the building in relation to Mr. Coleman's building, and I have to say, despite viewing the plans extensively, it was only when faced with the actual situation I realised the shocking reality of Mr. Coleman's issue.
Thank you very much. Roy Coleman, resident at number 60 Charminster Avenue. Notwithstanding the comments which we heard at the start of this meeting, I believe that many of them remain with the amended plans, and therefore I respectfully request that that letter be reintroduced. Whilst many of the issues raised in my original letter of October 2018, my reference 1, remain relevant, my concern is primarily the loss of light which the development will have on my home, number 60 Charminster Avenue. Having lived at number 60 continuously for over 20 years, I believe that my mother and I enjoy a right to light, specifically to continue to enjoy the natural light afforded to us by the kitchen, stairs and WC windows which face the proposed development. In conjunction with the L-shaped layout of number 58, as originally built, these windows provide the primary light source for much of our house. Even with the reduced number of proposed flats, I believe that my comments in reference 1 are valid, and that considering the mass and scale of the proposed development, our right to light will be adversely affected. Whilst this will deprive our kitchen of much light, our stairs, landing and entrance hall will also suffer. I find that the true impact of the development is difficult to assess from the plans submitted, partly as the size, shape and location of number 60 Charminster Avenue in relation to number 58 has changed several times throughout the process. And also because not all affected windows are detailed on the site plan. However, the situation was put into stark relief earlier this week when Councillor Dunlop, Mrs Pike and myself met on site with a planning officer and the developer. We were shown that the ground had been marked out with tape denoting the extent of the proposed two-storey extension. Whilst I appreciate the efforts of the developer in this regard, it served only to reinforce my fears that this development would have a significant and detrimental effect on the quality of the lives of my mother and myself. I am not aware of any formal process having been undertaken to refute my claim, and I ask that the committee and the developer respect our right to light. My second point would be market demand. According to the property site Rightmove, there are approximately 120 1- and 2-bed flats to buy or let within a 15-minute walk of the proposed development. Notwithstanding a desire to meet government targets, I believe that the demand for the type of accommodation proposed is already satisfied. I will not be going into detail regarding the current congestion and parking situation. You can see from the photographs presented that there is already an issue. The photographs were taken on Tuesday and were not taken during peak rush hour or during the school run. We have 5 schools in the area. In conclusion, whilst I may welcome a smaller, more modest development, I respectfully ask that the Planning Committee reject this application as presented. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for that. I believe the agent acting on behalf of the applicant, Giles Moore, wishes to speak.
Chairman and members, thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of the application on behalf of the applicants, McMorton Developments Limited. The applicants have worked proactively with officers to address and respond to the initial concerns which officers had, and are pleased to see the application has been recommended for approval. As set out in your officer's report, the application when first submitted was for 6 flats. This has been revised to the proposed 5 flats. The revisions have reduced the height of the proposal so that it mirrors the height of the neighbouring properties. Amenity space has been provided to the rear of the site, and the scale of the building reduced so as not to impact upon neighbouring properties, particularly, as you've heard, with regard to the adjacent property, 60 Charminster Avenue. The application site is in a sustainable location within an existing residential area and has good access to local services and facilities. As such, the principle of providing additional residential units is established, and the proposal make efficient use of the site, contributing towards the Council's identified housing need. The site is not within a designated local or district centre, and whilst the property historically consisted of a commercial unit, this has not been operated for some considerable time. A marketing exercise was undertaken prior to the submission of the application, and the only interest in relation to the continued use of the commercial unit was as an office. This was not progressed as it was not considered to be viable. There was also interest from a car sales forecourt, which equally wasn't progressed. As summarised in the officer's report, the loss of the commercial unit, which will provide much needed housing, will not be harmful to the economic viability of the area. The character of the area, as you've seen from the photographs, consists predominantly of residential uses, and the application site is a corner site with frontage to both Charminster Avenue and Sutton Road. Within the site's immediate context, there are established precedents for properties and corner plots to have extended built form and address both road frontages. At the junction of Charminster Avenue and Grisham Road, which is to the south of the site, there is a 2.5 to 3 storey block of flats, which demonstrates that flatted schemes are an established feature in the area. Opposite the application site, on the southern corner of Charminster Avenue and Sutton Road, is a 2-storey extension which extends the boundary of the adjacent property. As you've seen from the plans, the proposed layout follows the established precedent and provides a separation distance which will form a clear visual gap between the built form of Charminster Avenue and that of the adjacent property in Sutton Road. Furthermore, the separation gap will be landscaped, providing visual relief and improved setting to the street scene. The plans show how the footprint of the proposal has been staggered so it follows the line of Sutton Road. The use of a staggered floor plan introduces additional articulation to the overall design and provides relief to Sutton Road elevation, emphasising its subservience to the main frontage with Charminster Avenue. With regard to how the proposal addresses the corner of Charminster Avenue and Sutton Road, it is considered the proposed layout will improve the site's visual relationship to the street and improve the legibility of the street. Soft landscaping is proposed along the frontage of Sutton Road, which will define the site boundary. This will be an improvement to the current expanse of hard standing. The amended plans, as referred to in the officer's report, have improved the relationship with 60 Charminster Avenue. A single-storey element is proposed adjacent to the kitchen window of 60 Charminster Avenue, and the proposed 2-storey element is set some 5.2 metres back from the window. This separation distance will ensure that the proposal does not impact detrimentally on the amenities of the occupiers in number 60. In relation to Sutton Road, number 37, the adjacent property, the built form is some 15 metres from the adjacent property, and as you've seen from the plans in front of you, the bin store will be an enclosed bin store and the existing boundary hedging will be retained. And in terms of the relationship of the bin store to number 37, the primary amenity area is to the rear of the property, and as you've seen from the photographs, the frontage of 37 is open to the street. In summary, the proposal will provide 5 additional new residential properties in a sustainable location, reusing a previously developed brownfield site. The applicant has worked with officers to address the concerns which have been raised. This has resulted in a number of proposed flats being reduced from the originally proposed 6 to 5. I hope members that you're able to support the officer's recommendation and approve the application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I believe the ward councillor wishes to talk on this.
Thank you. Chairman, board members, I'd like to wrap up what you've heard. I want to firstly reiterate that no one here is against a development. That's not what this is about. It's about ensuring that the development doesn't affect the amenities of the nearest neighbours. I know the planning officer has worked on this application for months, has made several site visits and adjustments, particularly where the drawings have proved to be inaccurate and to the detriment of the 2 immediate neighbours, at number 60 Charminster Avenue and immediately behind 39 Sutton Road. And I trust that every member here has read the extensive comments that have come in, and in particular the very comprehensive one from Mr. Coleman, detailing how this development will affect him. And directly, the most important issue is about light. Number 60 Charminster Avenue's kitchen window, as you can see, looks straight out onto the courtyard of number 58. And if you look at the aerial photograph, you can see the properties are very close together. So the only light coming into 58 through the kitchen and on that side elevation of 58 is the distance between the building, the elevation of 58 and that courtyard. So it's specifically that distance. Now that's the original window, which is obviously much smaller than what we have today. Now paragraph 39 of the planning officer's report identifies that window as the main source of light. None of the plans submitted by the developer have shown the elevation of 58 as it's looked onto from the side of number 60. But in essence, number 60's outlook from that kitchen is the two-storey outer wall of 58. The current distance is as built, and it's stepped back from the neighbours as it was originally built, and partially intentionally built for that purpose of creating light, keeping that distance, keeping a reasonable outlook. Now the plans have been scaled back for the second floor, but it's not enough. I quote paragraph 39, a 5.2 metre gap ensuring reasonably open aspect and level of light. What is reasonably? Whose perception is reasonably? It's certainly not number 60's. No calculations have been carried out to determine this reasonably. My perception would be that a two-storey brick wall only 5 metres away from my kitchen window and the other windows on the side of my house, filling the skyline and thus removing my main source of light, isn't reasonably. Number 60's right to light is not negotiable. It's established at law and has been uninterrupted since 1969. There is only one way to ensure number 60's right to light remains uninterrupted and reasonable, which is to keep the existing building line of the current second floor on that elevation. In essence, take out that corner, that right-hand corner of the second floor of the proposed development to preserve the rights of the occupants of number 60. And should you be minded to grant this application, I respectfully ask that you do ensure you preserve Mr. Coleman's right to light by instructing the developer to maintain the current building line at that point. I'd like to move on to paragraph 43 of the planning officer's report referencing Sutton Road, which is immediately behind the development. The first site plan ever submitted had the bins very neatly on Sutton Road, adjacent to the development, sort of on this bottom line where those little bushes are to the right. More importantly, not within a sniffing distance of number 37's kitchen window. The bins have been moved from that location to the back of the property where they are now, right in front of the kitchen window and back door of number 37 Sutton Road. Now, we did ask the planning officer why they couldn't at least be swapped with the cycle store that no one's going to use. Apparently, that would mean the bin doors would open out in front of the amenity space, possibly affecting the new residents. Now, this is absolutely no criticism of the planning officer, but what kind of logic says that it's okay, almost finished, for the smelly bins to waft onto the amenity space? It's not okay for the smelly bins to waft onto the amenity space of the new residents, but it's okay if it wafts onto the under the kitchen window of the lady that lived behind. And I get that refuse has to be a maximum distance from the highway, but it is possible to put them back where they were and just create a little small path onto that highway. Just 1 second, I'm almost finished. Again, I ask the board that if you are minded to grant, then please accept that it is totally unacceptable for Mrs. Pike behind to have the smelly bins from up to a dozen people. Then it's not her rubbish. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe the planning officer just wants to put something in quickly before this goes to debate. Is everybody happy to? Yeah.
It would actually be the legal officer, Chairman.
Sorry, Chairman, I was just going to correct that, yes. I just wanted to clarify with the board that the right to light has been mentioned on more on occasion in deputations. I'd just like to say that that is actually a private matter and not one that you should be discussing. If they have got a claim to right to light, it's not something that would involve you this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and we go into debate. Does anybody wish to start?
Chairman, may I just come back on that?
Chairman, I think we perhaps have to differentiate here between reasonable residential amenities, which is something that's a material consideration that you should have regard to, and rights to light, which is in the matter of easements, covenants and so on, not something to which you can attach weight. If there is a legal right to light, that should be established by the individual party. You can therefore have regard to reasonable residential amenities in considering this application. That is a material consideration. I think it's the term that's perhaps confusing rather than the entitlement to consider the issue of light and outlook.
Chairman, thank you. If I just come back, I agree exactly with what the planning officer has just said. What I was referring to was a specific legal concept which is referred to as the right to light, which is totally separate to how you would view it from a planning concept. So what I'm saying is that the right to light as a legal concept is not something you look at today. Obviously, you will look at your own policies on reasonableness and issues to do with light in that sense, but not what we in legal know as a right to light.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Does anybody wish to start the debate? Councillor Leporvidin.
So if that's all right, I'd like to clarify a couple of things. The first thing is it refers to a conversion of the premises. Can you outline what of the existing building is remaining and what's being replaced?
I don't know what the easiest way to do this is. You'll see the blue outline which shows the existing building. So much of that building will be retained, and then there are extensions to the rear. So if I go back to the site plan, so the is here, I believe, and then here. So all of this is additional. This is single story here. This is 2-story here, and single story there. So that gives you a better idea. The floor plan there, you can see this is the first floor level. All of these bits here are single story. So the bits to either side and the bit at the far rear. So on the elevation, it's this area here that's additional, and that single story bit there.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask the other clarification? Following on from the debate that's just been had, have you got a mock-up, a visual of looking, say, from the rear amenity area towards 58 and 60 of how the relationship is?
What you mean, photos? I've got photos from the site which give you some idea.
No, I'm meaning from the plans, not as it is now, as it
I
would
don't have
be.
elevation plans of the neighbouring properties. No, that's not something we would normally expect to receive with a
Well, have you
planning
got an elevation
application.
of the rear of the proposal then?
I've got, yeah, we have elevations of the proposal. So this is the rear of the property. So that would be looking towards Sutton Road, looking towards number 37 Sutton Road.
Have you got it looking from the amenity area of 58 back?
No, as I say, we
towards-
don't normally have elevations of neighbouring properties.
No,
we
no,
only
of
have.
58, of the proposal for 58.
I'm not sorry. I'm not. This is 58. I'm not really sure
Yeah.
what you mean.
Which of those is the rear, as you would be looking, as you would be standing in the amenity area at the back? looking towards Charminster
Towards-
Road.
Towards number 6.
Chairman, can I just clarify, the councillor, the top left-hand image is the rear elevation. So if we can just go back to the, if I could ask my colleague to take you back to the, you got the pointer? So if we, for the sake of clarity, let's talk about that as the rear elevation. So you can see the two-storey element, single-storey element. So that is the rear elevation. Let's talk about that as the north elevation. If we can go back to the elevations again. So the rear elevation, so that is the view of the back of the proposed building as seen from its amenity area. So
Right, thank you. That was the...
that is the elevation that would be the north elevation as seen from the adjoining property, the kitchen window sitting into opposite here somewhere.
Thank you.
Councillor Bartlett.
Is there a roof on the bin and cycle storage?
They are both enclosed and they do have a flat roof. It is within the report. I haven't got the slide for it, but it is within your report.
Does anybody else wish to? Councillor Stribley.
Thank you. I've got a number of questions. First of all, the boundary along Sutton Road and then into Charminster Avenue, how is that being treated? At present there is part of a wall and a hedge which is long past sell-by date.
On the screen is the street view plan which has been submitted, and you'll see that that shows a low boundary wall with hedge behind. There is a gap in the wall, and that is to allow access for the bins to come out onto the highway, because obviously for servicing they need to be able to do that.
I appreciate that, Chairman, but as you approach Charminster Avenue, there may well be another gap in the wall to allow access to the main door, but will that boundary wall continue around the curve of the site into Charminster Avenue and again have hedging behind it, which would be significant in the street scene?
As you can see from the street scene above, that's actually the view from looking from Charminster Avenue, and there is a low boundary wall with landscaping. You can also see, if you look on the site plan, the green and the circles indicates landscaping to the front of the site.
But it doesn't indicate where the boundary wall runs.
No, it's not shown on that plan. There is a condition, I believe it's a condition. Condition number 10 requires the boundary details to be submitted for consideration by the planning department, and we would expect, given the street scene there, for there to be a low boundary wall as shown on the street scene elevation.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I ask that that be conditioned in, because I've seen far too many developments where we see it beautifully laid out on the plan and it doesn't happen in the end. I think if the comment about smells from the bin store were made, they were extremely unfortunate. There should be no smells from such a bin store, but we hear it's a bin store, will have a flat roof. I've seen many bin stores which are just in effect fences with gaps between the boarding, Is this solid boarding? Is it brick? Is it permanent? What sort of treatment is around the bin store and the cycle store?
It's a solid building. I believe it's a timber-clad building with a roof on. It's solid and fully enclosed with doors that open towards the front on Sutton Road.
Again, Chairman, I'm a little bit concerned about that. It sounds nebulous. If it's done properly, it would be fine. If not, and I think the committee should be given those details. With regard to the concerns which have been raised from the neighbours about light, looking at the putting the compass across it, the northwest elevations, the existing kitchen window at number 60 cannot get any direct light from anywhere until the sun is due southwest. So that's late afternoon anyway. So it's totally shaded by the existing two-storey building first thing in the morning until mid-late afternoon. And again, looking at the plans, it does appear that the neighbouring properties had a rear elevation at some time in the past, which had probably obscured or filled in the original larger window to the rear. But given that the side extension is cut back and is single storey, at all times the sun should be well over the roof of that single storey and should not take light away from it. Although I do understand the concerns of people worried about change and if it might affect. But I really can't see that happening. If the boundary treatment is taken properly, a low boundary wall, hedging or shrubbery as shown on the plans behind it, then I think there will be a considerable improvement in the street scene, and I don't see any planning reason to refuse it. The applicants might like to perhaps be a little bit more considerate and move the bin store along. I can't see that it should have any adverse impact on either the amenity space of this property or of its neighbours, not if it's properly dealt with.
Are you proposing that as a condition formally, or you mentioned a condition
About the boundary?
about the bin store, I think?
No, I
No.
suggested
It's a
the
suggestion.
applicants could be neighbourly and relocate that, which shouldn't be a problem.
Chairman, if I can perhaps just pick up on the councillor's comments. I think that the existing condition in the recommendation on boundary treatment, requiring the details to be brought forward, is adequate to enable us to secure appropriate boundary treatment. However, we will note the views that have been expressed in committee in terms of discharging that condition. The applicants are in the room and have heard the committee's comments. And of course, that is what is indicated on the street view elevations. It would therefore be reasonable for us to anticipate that when we see those boundary treatments, it will reflect the kind of treatment that the councillor has suggested.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Councillor O'Neill?
Yeah, I thought that Amanda Pike's request to rotate the cycle store with the bin store was not unreasonable. I'd like to understand why it's not possible.
I assessed the application obviously with the plans in front of me. Looking at it as a planning officer, the bin store is fully enclosed. It has doors that open away from the neighbouring property. And it was my assessment that the distance from her windows was reasonable, and the fact that it was enclosed and opening away would be acceptable. If they were to swap it around, my only concern with that is that the doors would be opening pretty much straight onto the amenity space. With a neighbouring resident, the amenity space is at the rear of her property. Where the bin stores are now, they're still opening and they're still within a couple of metres of the amenity space of the residents, but they're not directly adjacent to it. That was my assessment.
Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chairman. It was mentioned earlier that there was a site visit between neighbours, planning officer and the applicant. Could I ask just the planning officer to confirm, one, the time of day of the visit, and in particular with respect to number 60, where you were mapping out where the extension would go to, what type of conversations you were having about the loss of light? Thank you.
The purpose of the meeting actually was to check the accuracy of the plans, because it had been raised previously that there was an inaccuracy with the survey plan for the neighbouring property. I myself had been out on site with the architect previously and looked at it, and I spoke to the ward councillor and said, look, we've been in and we think the plans are accurate now, but we're happy to meet you and the resident on site to check that. So that was the purpose of the meeting. We didn't really discuss the merits of the scheme. It was more the accuracy of the plans. The developer, when we got there, had actually marked out with tape the where the two-storey element would be. So it was just checking that the plans were accurate and confirming that where the proposed building line was going to be was set back beyond the window. That was what we discussed.
Thank you for that. Just coming back on the part about the existing building would restrict some light. Have you been in number 60 and you've seen what the situation is now to appreciate what it could be?
Yes, I have, and this is why I had the scheme amended in the first place, because having been into the site, the scheme previously had two-storey development projecting beyond that window. Having been into the site, I could see that where an extension had been put on the back of the building, there now wasn't light coming from the rear, so this window would be the primary window to the kitchen. And that's why I asked the developer to amend the site, because I wasn't happy with the relationship with the building being in front of that window. I feel that with the setback, now most of the window is quite open, it has quite open aspect, and so the amount of light is sufficient for that window to be acceptable. And the single story element, which is closer to the window, is at a level and with a sloping roof that slopes away, so light would be coming over the top of the window.
Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. I think the officer has addressed the concerns of the light, and I think the fact that the waste store has got a roof on it, is fully enclosed, also meets the concerns regarding smell. I personally find no material objections why we should not support the officer's recommendation here, and I propose that we should grant this application.
Does anybody else wish to speak before we... Do I have a seconder for that then? Councillor Johnson?
Yeah, I'll second that.
And a vote. Those for?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Those against?
1. Yeah.
And abstentions?
1 and 2.
And that's granted. So we'll be moving on to the second item, which is item B, 20 Upton Way Pool, and we're going to hear from the planning officer.
Hello. Hi. Good afternoon, members. Just for those who don't know me, my name is Kate Robson. I'm one of the planning officers in Poole. This application is 20 Upton Way in Broadstone. It's an outline application for 6 flats. Access, layout and scale are to be considered now. Appearance and landscaping are reserved matters. Just a general location showing you the site in relation to Broadstone. And the specific location is on the northwest side of Upton Way. Originally the site was a double width plot, hence we've got number 20 Upton Way, number 24 Upton Way, and there is not a number 22. The area is residential, predominantly characterised by detached houses in large plots. This is an extract, it's the policies map of the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan. Policy BP5 of the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan states that new residential development will be supported subject to the following criteria, and the first of those criteria being 1 and 2 bed dwellings in the inner zone as shown on this figure. The application site is outlined in red, and as you can see it is within the inner zone. The preamble to policy BP5 states it is not just a matter of building new dwellings, but rather building the right type of dwelling. The greatest level of need is for smaller dwellings of 1 and 2 bed units, such as apartments and mews-style housing, to meet the demand from young singles or newly married couples, as well as from older residents wishing to downsize from under-occupied larger detached properties. The inner zone offers the most sustainable location for the development of 1 and 2 bed dwellings. Over the lifetime of the plan, it is anticipated that the number of 1 and 2 bed units will exceed the number of new 3 and 4 bed units, thus addressing the issue of greatest need. We have some street and site photos here. From the front, the levels changes across the site are not particularly apparent, but you can see from the hoarding on the photo on the top right that describes the levels falling, and you can also see from the existing terrace on the existing property at number 20 on the bottom left photo, that gives you an idea of how the levels drop into the site. As way of background, the site plan on the left is a scheme for 2 bungalows in the rear that officers considered unacceptable, was refused under the scheme of delegation, and officers successfully defended at appeal. The one on the right is currently being defended at appeal at the moment, and that's for a single bungalow in the back, in addition to the 2 semi-detached properties. On the right is the scheme for 2 semi-detached, one pair of semi-detached properties that has extant planning permission. On the left is the site plan currently under consideration. The footprint of the building is predominantly the same in terms of the spacing to the side boundaries. There is an additional single-storey projection to the rear. Parking is to the rear of the properties. Parking to the front, as you can see from between the 2 plans, has been reduced over the approved plan, along with a separate pedestrian access in, which does reinstate some of the frontage character and provides further opportunities for landscaping. This slide provides an overview of the scheme under consideration now. On the top right is the latest street scene drawing, which was circulated as an addendum item. It's important to note that this street scene does not change what's under consideration. It merely captures the scheme's perception from the footway outside of the site, which is at a higher level. So we have, again, the street scene as proposed now is on the top, and on the bottom is as approved. You'll note there's not much in the way of differences. Appearance is a reserved matter, so this is something that would be looked at in detail at the reserved matters stage, but scale is for consideration now. During the course of the application, detailed floor plans have been received to ensure the relationship with the neighbouring properties is acceptable. As previously mentioned, the addition to the plans under consideration now, compared to those previously approved, is a single-storey projection at the rear, which would allow for a roof terrace on the upper ground floor of a shallow depth with privacy screens to the side. The first floor is the same, and the second floor enables an additional flat in the roof space. The bedroom window of the lower ground floor has an outlook over the driveway, which would enable some natural surveillance. Proposed is an obscure glazing condition to ensure overlooking of neighbouring properties does not occur. And that's predominantly on the bathroom windows of the upper ground floor first floor flats, and then the second floor side facing roof lights bar the frontmost, which would be set sufficiently forward such as to not create a harmful degree of overlooking. As previously explained, the site is located within the inner zone as defined in the Broadstone neighbourhood plan. It's also located within a sustainable transport corridor under the Poole local plan, which is one of the areas identified for the majority of development to be located. Therefore, the principle of 6 flats on the site is supported by the development plan. Looking specifically at the character of the area, the building scale, bar the single-storey projection, is the same as previously approved. Therefore, we need to consider the other differences that arise from 6 flats as opposed to 2 houses, i.e. the access drive, parking, bin store and cycle store. The bin store is a small structure in the front garden with sufficient space around for some landscaping. The cycle store is wholly domestic in scale and character. It's set down into the plot, so glimpses of the roof would be possible. A lot of concern has been expressed in the letters of representation regarding the visibility of the rear parking. Hopefully this plan will help to quantify that. When walking across the site frontage, there is a narrow window approximately 4 metres where views of the rear parking area would be possible, albeit that this parking area is set down at a lower level. This window of visibility would be reduced with some landscaping in the front and if there were any cars parked to the front of the existing property. In terms of the access drive, we also need to consider the permitted development fallback position. Such a driveway could be constructed under permitted development without planning permission for the extant approval for the pair of semi-detached properties. It would be read as dropping down between the 2 buildings as a driveway does, albeit not to the rear, just to the side, several properties further along. Moving on to neighbour amenity, there are no material issues in terms of outlook, and I've previously discussed overlooking. Our recent experience of appeal decisions that we have been unable to successfully defend impact on neighbours from noise and disturbance from access road with schemes of this scale. The scheme provides appropriate levels of internal and external amenity for future occupants. It meets parking standards as acceptable from a highway safety point of view. Therefore, in conclusion, the scheme does not give rise to any material harm to the character of the area or neighbour amenity. Furthermore, it meets an identified local housing need, and the scheme is wholly in accordance with the development plan, i.e. the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan and the Pool Local Plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I believe we have one person speaking in objection today, Mr. Richard Wilson.
I'm a chartered town planner, resident of Upton Way, Broadstone. This statement has been prepared in consultation with and on behalf of residents of Upton Way and adjoining streets, 30 of whom have objected in writing to the current application. The principal reason for concern in respect of this ill-conceived development are the local planning authority is wrong to accept an outline application when they knew they would be making a sensitive judgment about impact on the character of the area. This is reinforced by the inaccurate illustrative drawings drawn to applicants' attention by someone advising the objectors and resulting in revised drawings being submitted last week. They're also wrong to give such positive pre-app advice, given the then outstanding appeal on the site and now the comments of the inspector in dismissing the appeal. In addition, there is a further appeal outstanding. The fact is, the case officer jumped the gun and the report before the committee largely reflects a premature pre-app advice. The fact that the points made by the appeal inspector and set out in all our objections, including the main paragraph of Councillor Brooks' objection letter, apply in this case. The access road still occupies the full width of the side elevations of the frontage properties, interrupting the rhythm and harmony of the street scene, worsened by the visibility splays. Even though there are no bungalows to be glimpsed, the very large area of parking and turning would be apparent and would indicate that uncharacteristic development had occurred. These are the appeal inspector's words. The current recommendation to approve this application for a block of 6 flats could be seen as perverse, bearing in mind that there is an outstanding appeal for a lower density scheme, for which the council has maintained its resistance. In her appeal statement, the council case officer indicated that the proposed layout and extent of hard surfacing would appear cramped and represent overdevelopment to the site in a manner that would not reflect the prevailing pattern and layout of development in the locality. The development would harm the area's spacious, sylvan character and an appearance contrary to policies PP 27 and PP 28 of the Pool Local Plan. Whilst this scheme has no bungalows, it more than makes up for this in impact terms by the much greater area of parking and turning hard surfaces. Reference is made by the case officer to the limited visual difference between a block of 6 flats and the approved semi-detached pair. However, there are 2 points here. The impact is not just about visual impact, it's also importantly about the noise and disturbance created by the 9 vehicles driving in and out of the rear garden area, and secondly, this is an outline application and the designs are purely indicative. The final impact when the scheme is fully worked up could be far greater. As identified by Councillor Book, there is also a social impact. Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan Policy BP5 aims to achieve a balance in Broadstone's housing stock. Whilst the Housing Needs Assessment of 2015 identified a need for smaller units, and hence the creation of the inner zone within the Broadstone Plan, it needs to be understood that this does not just mean flats. Over the last few years, over 100 flats have been built or given planning permission within the inner zone. None of these flats are occupied by families with young children. One of the consequences of this is there are not enough young children within Broadstone to fill the first school places. In the same time period, only 2 pairs of semi-detached properties have been built. To construct 6 flats in this location instead of the 2 semis that have already received planning permission would further distort the housing stock. The proposal now submitted would have a very serious adverse effect on the character of Upton Way, damaging its low density, well landscaped character, losing the opportunity to rebalance the housing stock and set an expectation that regardless of impact on prevailing character, high density development of flats will be supported in locations such as these. It is therefore respectfully requested that this application be refused. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I believe we've got the applicant or the agent, the applicant.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members. My name is Get there in the end. Good afternoon, members. My name is Darryl Howells and I'm a Director of Pure Town Planning. I am here before you today to speak in support of my client's planning application for the erection of a block of 6 two-bedroom flats. As you will be aware, planning applications must be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material planning considerations indicate otherwise. The reference to the previous speaker in respect of the appeals relate to a different scheme, so in my opinion has limited effect or influence as a material planning consideration. You will also be fully aware the development plan comprises the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan and the Poole Local Plan, both adopted in 2018. According to the Neighbourhood Plan, the application site falls within the inner zone, as defined as being within a 5 minutes walk of the main shopping area. Policy BP5, titled Balancing the Housing Stock, confirms that inside the inner zone, development proposals for 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings will be supported. The Neighbourhood Forum might suggest that the policy refers to dwellings, not flats. However, I would draw this committee's attention to the preamble wording in paragraph 3.4.6 of the plan. In that paragraph it states, the greatest level of need is for smaller dwellings of 1 and 2 bedroom units, such as apartments. The demand comes from younger members of our community looking to gain that first step on the property ladder, or individuals looking to downsize. Irrespective of the type of housing, the neighbourhood plan is clear that there is an identified housing need for smaller homes such as flats. This proposal meets that need. The next local plan document is the Poole Local Plan. In that document, policy PP2 advocates that proposals for flats inside sustainable transport corridors will be supported. The eastern section of Upton Way is a designated sustainable transport corridor. As such, the application site is within that designation and therefore the principle of flats is acceptable. Policy PP28 then advises that flatter development will be acceptable if the scale and massing of the building accords with the character of the area. As you have heard, the proposed building is similar to the size of building for the approved semi-detached houses which has been implemented. The height of the proposed building is compatible with its immediate neighbours. The proposal retains ample amenity space for the occupiers and provides a setting to the building. Either side of the rear car parking area, there is a minimum of 7 metres worth of communal gardens, which will provide opportunities for planting to screen the car parking and to prevent noise disturbance from vehicles. Adequate bins and cycle storage will be provided, and your planning officer is satisfied that the scheme will positively contribute to the area. No harm to neighbouring amenities will occur as overlooking has been designed out of the scheme, and where balconies do occur, a balcony screening condition will be imposed. Prior to the application being submitted, in accordance with the Council's preference, my client submitted a pre-application for the flatted development. The conclusion received from this Council was positive, confirming that the proposed use of the site for flats, namely 6, complied with adopted planning policies. Recently, following the submission of the application, the planning officer has carried out a full and detailed consideration of the scheme and determined on its own planning merits that the scheme would provide social and economic benefits to the area without environmental harm. The proposed development fully complies with the Council's adopted local plan and adopted Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan, and therefore I'd ask you to support the officer's recommendation to approve. Thank you.
I believe the ward councillor wishes to speak on this.
Fine, thank you, Chairman. You've heard a lot about the Broadstone local plan. One of the things you haven't heard about is the National Planning Policy framework and some of the issues related to that, within which, of course, the local plan must reside. It is possible to overcome the presumption to grant through recognising significant adverse impacts which demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the framework and within the local plan. And I hope that some of the information that was provided by the residents and that I will provide will actually demonstrate that. And reference is made, of course, to the character of this, and the inspector, despite the comment made by the applicant's representative, focused very heavily on that driveway and recognised that it would break up the character of the area and would be detrimental to the area, irrespective of whether you've got the bungalows or car parking there. And you do have the issue of noise, pollution from the cars in the rear, and that, again, putting rear car parking into this scenario does, again, break the current character of the area. Quality of design is also important. I'm making no reference to the actual outside appearance of the house, but we've heard reference to sufficient or ample amenity space. We're looking at 6 flats here and less than 30% of the whole site being given over to amenity space. Policy BP4 excludes car parking as being described as amenity space. So you have to dismiss all that area from being regarded as amenity. You may or may not be aware that 4 of the 6 units that are being proposed are at the absolute minimum space dimensions as set out by the government. That's 4 out of the 6. That is an indication, together with the lack of outside space, that this site is being overdeveloped, when in comparison we have a pair of semi-detached properties which clearly were approved before the local plan and the neighbourhood plan were actually adopted, and therefore are perfectly set within that area. The application fails to address the housing balance appropriately, and paragraph 8b, social objectives of the National Planning Policy Framework, require a range of homes to meet the needs of present and future generations, and there is no presumption that the 1 and 2 bedroom units or small properties should be flats. In Broadstone, over recent years, we've seen, as mentioned, 100 plus flats either built or planned, only 2 pairs, plus this one, 3 pairs of semis in the same time period. No other smaller units have been built. We are beginning to see a significant move away from a balance in favour of actually elderly people. And if you look at the idea of downsizing, when you look at the latest development of 36 flats in Waterman House, the majority of people who occupy that come from outside Broadstone, from Leicestershire, from London, and from other parts of Poole. So the downsizing that these flats supposedly encourage do not necessarily do so, and therefore still leave a significant demand for homes that could be suitable for young families with young children, and the semis that are approved would help to meet that need. If you look at the latest figures from Broadstone First School, in year 4 you have 60% of the pupils are from Broadstone. By the time you get to year 1, you have and reception year, you've got 63% are coming from outside Broadstone. In the last 5 years, there has been a significant switch from inside Broadstone to the school to people coming in from outside, because we have not got the balance of housing right for young families. The social element in terms of cars, traffic coming in, somewhere in the region of 150 out of the 300 if I may just finish, pupils are coming from outside in cars, so it's congestion, it is pollution, and for the planning officer to write that this approval has no impact on the environment is in fact wrong.
Okay.
I urge you please to refuse the application on the grounds that you can.
Thank you very much. Does any member wish to open the debate? Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. Some very eloquent deputations there, and I'd like to start probably with the last deputation, where a number of objections have been raised which are considered to raise significant adverse impacts. Of all the observations that were made, it's difficult to pick out any of those observations that are material planning objections. Most of the issues have been raised by the officer's report, and in fact clarified where, for example, the driveway, where it would be possible to build that under permitted development in any case. So, you know, to object about the driveway is really, you know, when it can be built anyway, is in my view non-material issue. So that's the driveway. In terms of the noise, well, and what is described as affecting the character of the area, the fact that there's going to be some parking at the rear. I think it was covered by the officer where it was clarified that the visual amenity is not really harmed by the parking at the rear of the property, particularly because of the dropping of the contour of the ground as you enter into it. And that there was actually a very small visible window where, looking from the street, where you would actually be able to see the cars, and that even may be mitigated with some bushes, etc. So that would probably be reduced even further. But in terms of noise, of course, yes, cars will make a noise, they're going in and out, but you have to balance that, I think, against the need for, if you even accept that there is a noise issue there, and you have to look at it in the noise issue in the context of the site, not of the overall area, I believe, because I don't think that this would have an overall adverse effect on the area. So I'm just looking at in terms of noise on the site and effect on neighbours. And given the distance, the separation distances, I guess there's a potential noise effect as cars drive down the driveway to the adjoining property that's already there. But you know, this is not unusual. It happens in all sorts of places. So whether that is sufficient, that if there is any harm there, is there sufficient harm to warrant refusing the application on that basis? My view is probably not. The amenity space was criticised. Well, there is significant amenity space, and it's far more than what we very often see with flat applications, where houses are converted in particular, and we're very often left with no amenity space whatsoever. Here, there's still, even with the parking in the back, you know, there's still significant amenity space available. I think the criticism that only 4 of the 6 flats met the national size limits. I mean, I don't see that as a criticism. I actually see that as a bonus, because very often we see a number of flats being built that are below, and so I think it's good that they do meet the minimum standards. That's what they're for, and in fact 2 of them exceed it. So that's in my view, that's a plus and not a negative. there was a criticism that the site is being overdeveloped, and there was no criticism note of the appearance of the and the size, the massing, the scale of the building, which I don't believe is. I think it fits in very well with the overall character of the site. So I don't see there's any issue in terms of overdevelopment. Clearly, it fits in there. The size is appropriate. It doesn't look out of place. It's in keeping with the size of the other buildings in the street scene. So I personally don't see an issue with that. And the last point, I think, was made on the housing balance in terms of the local plan. Well, you know, the schools and all those issues. The fact is that they may be emerging issues in terms of the balance, but the fact is that what's being proposed complies with a local plan. And so, you know, whilst there may be some influencing going on, it's still compliant with the local plan. So I think, you know, I think the plan officer has done a good job on this, and I personally have no problem supporting the recommendation to grant. But I won't move at this point because obviously it's early in the debate.
Councillor Stribley.
Sorry, I visited the site with a colleague this morning, so I am particularly au fait with it. I have a number of concerns about it, in that this would probably introduce the first flats in the road, which is characterised by large detached houses in substantial plots, as the planning officer outlined. My concern is that introducing parking into the rear of the property is extremely unneighbourly to number 24 Upton Way, and also to the properties at the rear, which I believe front Clarendon Road. It's a bit too small on the plan to, but front the other road and have shorter rear gardens. I accept that the front design generally fits into the street scene because it's sort of mirroring the height of adjacent properties and so on. But the fact is that you're looking at 6 flats, and what we have here is an outline permission. At the rear there are terraces and balconies to those flats. Now those flats are elevated because the ground drops away, and anybody on those balconies will have not a direct side view into the neighbouring garden, but they will have views down the garden into their neighbours and again into the rear of the properties in Clarendon Road. So if they were to be permitted, I would like to see all the screening to the balconies to be obscure, so that, yes, okay, you can stand up and look over half, and you could get a stepladder and stand up and look over your neighbour's hedge if you wanted to. But this is outline, and if you look at the direction and setting of it, you have the kitchen sitting rooms looking northeast and the bedrooms looking southwest. Now, quite frankly, if it was a flat I wanted to live in, I would want my living room, sitting room with the southerly aspect, and I can just see the floor plans being flipped over into reverse, so that you would have much more activity to the rear of the property with its consequent overlooking of the neighbouring properties. So I do have issues with the introduction of parking into the rear garden, which doesn't happen anywhere at all in that road, out of context and out of character with the area, in that there are simply no other small flats in that road. And I do accept that, yes, a couple of houses, be they detached, semi-detached or whatever, could fit in because they would look similar. I do think this is out of context, and I suspect because it's an outline, we don't have a good illustrative view of what the rear elevation would be. We don't have an illustrative view of how the rear of the properties would overlook the neighbouring. And I think if you're not familiar with the area, you would need to be pretty careful with that one. Thank you, Chairman.
Does any other member wish to speak on this one? Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Chairman. All I'd like to ask is on the obscure glazing, because it does vary in level. What level are you proposing?
Chairman, at the moment, is there a question that seeks to address the councillor's suggestion about obscuring the whole of the balustrading? As it stands at the moment, the recommendation incorporates only screening to the edges of the balustrading to prevent looking laterally across into adjoining properties. I think what the councillor has suggested is that the whole of the balustrade be obscure glazing. Obscure glazing of the sides of the terraces prevent looking laterally into adjoining gardens. It would have a degree of obscurity, is that the right word? That would effectively prevent from a distance views into adjoining gardens. In terms of the obscure glazing of the general balustrade along the rear elevation, I have to say I don't feel I could support that as a proposal. I draw your attention to the fact that whatever the orientation, the proposal is that they are bedrooms out onto those terraces. There would be a similar degree of overlooking from the windows. They're shallow terraces, and I think, Chairman, that to introduce obscure glazing to the length of the balustrades, albeit to the balustrade height, 1.2 metres, wherever, would probably not be necessary, but is feasible if the committee felt that it was appropriate to preserve the amenities of neighbours.
Chairman, if I could come back on that, I personally would be minded to refuse this application, and I don't know if I've got a seconder, but I would so propose. But should the committee be minded to grant, I would request that the balconies are obscure glazed. Individuals can stand and look over them if they so wish, but they can't just sit there and gaze down for hours at a time into the neighbour's garden, which is, I think, the unneighbourly form of overlooking. And of course, ground floor is not very much. First floor, you're well over fence height, so you're unrestricted view into adjacent gardens. And the second floor, then you're even higher.
Sorry, Chairman, we'll be with you in just a minute, just checking a fact. Chairman, if I can just remind the committee of the way levels change into the site. You recall that the terraces are on the ground floor to all intents and purposes. If I can just remind you of the change in levels, the terrace on the ground floor of the existing house, which I'm highlighting there, is set slightly lower than the terrace would be on the ground floor of the proposals. If we can perhaps just go back to the floor plans again. So the lower ground floor, one terrace, sole terrace at ground floor level, which is effectively street level, so not particularly elevated. These are, this is merely a view down. These are not terraces. The only terraces is at the ground floor level, albeit that that's slightly elevated to the rear gardens. If the committee were minded to require those terraces to be obscure glazed in their entirety, it would be enforceable, it would be reasonable, it would be relating to planning, and it would be an acceptable condition. My own advice is I don't believe it's necessary to secure the privacy and amenities of surrounding residents. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Bartlett.
Just point of clarification, this is an outline application. Do the terracing and glazing come into what we're actually approving? So if we say this is acceptable now, then that's it.
Yes, they do, because layout and scale are for consideration now. So we've captured the conditions now that would require obscure glazing. Yeah.
Councillor Kelsey.
Thank you. I wonder if the planning officer could just read me out again what BP5 is, the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan, with regards to balancing of housing stock.
Sure. Do you want me to read out the actual policy? Yeah. Yes. No, it's fine. So BP5, balancing the housing stock. New residential development will be supported subject to the following criteria. Number 1, 1 and 2 bed dwellings in the inner zone as shown on figure 3.4. 3 bed dwellings and above in the outer zone. 3, where proposals depart from the above criteria, they should demonstrate how they would contribute to balancing the housing stock and meet site-specific requirements. Okay, thank you.
Before I move on to the next speaker, could you just clarify whether there's any more? So, because obviously the word dwelling, is it more specific, or is it just the word dwelling?
In the actual policy, it's the word dwelling. And then in the preamble, it discusses the greatest level of need is for smaller dwellings of 1 and 2 bed units, such as apartments and mews-style housing.
Councillor O'Neill, and then I'll come to Councillor Hall. He did indicate just slightly before.
I'd like to know what one you're proposing.
Chairman, generally speaking, we don't seek to attach a degree of obscurity to the conditions. The wording of the standard people of the borough we've historically used requires the glazing to be obscured to a level that effectively prevents overlooking. Members will be aware that even relatively lightly obscured glass, when looked at from close-up, obscures distant views. So there is no proposal in the recommendation to seek to specify a level of obscurity.
Should be, thank you.
Does anybody else wish to speak? Councillor Kelsey and Councillor Hilliard, and then we'll come to Councillor Kelsey.
Thank you, Chairman. I know we're just talking about outline permission at the moment, but can we also put a condition on the landscaping at the back, in particular about all round the car parking space, to keep in light from the headlights as well as noise reduction? Thank you.
So a reserve matters application would follow an outline. We couldn't put conditions on now, but we can take note of any specific issues, and at the reserve matter stage, when we consider the landscaping, we could ensure that important matters were addressed.
Chairman, if I could just come back on Councillor Hall's question. A quick consultation with one of my Bournemouth colleagues. I understand that it's been practiced in the Bournemouth part of the borough historically to reference in the Pilkington's standards for obscure. I'm sorry, that's not something we've historically done in Poole, but I gather that the standard condition used in the Bournemouth part of the borough has referenced Pilkington's level 3 obscure. I would be content if that were to be written into that the condition that we have on the side screens. That would be an appropriate level of obscurity.
I hope that answers your question. Councillor Kelsey.
Thank you. I quite agree with the wording of Councillor Bartlett earlier on in his summing up of what he thought of the application. I also have sympathy for Councillor Brooke, and I would also agree with Councillor Stribley in having the balustrades completely surrounded with obscure glazing. And you're quite right, Pilkington level 3 is what we've always used, and it's always been found to be satisfactory. It is a difficult one, but I would move the officer's recommendation on this, because unfortunately I think possibly the wording of the Broadstone local plan is a bit skewed in the way that it can be taken in many different ways, and it's always comes back to this dwellings. Is a dwelling a house or a flat? And many people will say that a dwelling is actually a house rather than just an apartment or flat. But I think it does say that in zone 1 and 2 inner zones it is acceptable to have flats and apartments there, and I don't think we can really then throw it out, because the local plan already says that, as does the Broadstone local plan. So I would move the recommendation of the officers, and I would also ask for the balustrades to have the full glazing as suggested by Councillor Stribley.
Would you like to propose that? Seconder, Councillor Bartlett. And go to the vote. All for?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Those against?
1, 2, 3.
And any abstentions?
And 1.
Is granted. Right, we will move on to the third item today, which is item A, the Oaks Garden Centre and Nursery, and we're going to move on to hear from the planning officer on this.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Eleanor Godesar. I'm a Senior Planning Officer. Eleanor Godesar, Senior Planning Officer at Poole. The application that's before you is at the Oaks Garden Centre and Nursery, Queen Anne Drive in Poole. It's for a temporary use of the part of the site for a car washing and drying facility for 3 years. Just to give you some context for those who are not so familiar with the Poole area of our authority, the application... Of course, yes. Is that better? Okay. Okay. It's in the northwest of the authority, as shown on this overall site plan, and then going into a more specific area, you can see the application site is on the southern boundary of the Oaks Garden Centre. Just to give you some context in terms of the site along Queen Anne Drive, and I'll just, where's the pointer? I apologise for those of you who've got your back to the screen, but I will just point out this is the area which is the front entrance. I'm just pointing to a building which is directly opposite the entrance, that is about 22 metres from the front. The application site is another 80 metres into the site and is sort of to the east. Giving you a bit more context, moving east along Queen Anne Drive, you've got a series of outbuildings, and then further along to the east And then this is the edge of the site. We've got another entrance, which is as lawful development, but we have got the car sales, which you're all aware of, which will be considered another committee. Just turning into the actual application site in the south of the south of the nursery. We've got the view looking directly south. This area here would be where the car wash will be. We've got the southern boundary, which has got in order. View to the west, again looking along the tree line. To the east, we've got an area of storage, and you can't quite see it on the photo, but to the rear of this photo where the buildings are is where the approved scaffolding business is, which is under operation. And then just to the north, we've got the existing car parking area for the nursery. The application site is within Greenbelt, and Greenbelt is spelt out within the National Planning Policy Framework. And I'll just read out the purpose of the main aim of the Greenbelt is to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. Essential characteristics of greenbelts are their openness and their permanence. Construction of new buildings in the greenbelt is inappropriate, but there are exceptions. And one of these is limited infilling or partial complete redevelopment of previously developed land, which would not have a greater impact on the openness than the existing development. I'll just draw your attention to the lawful development certificate, which really started this whole site off in terms of the nursery. It was approved in 1992, and you can see that the outline of the site in green and the buildings. It has been accepted over time that whole site is to be considered as a nursery as opposed to specifying the actual buildings. Whoops. So this application site is within previously developed land, and I'll just define that, it's defined in the MPPF. I'll just read that out to you as well. So previously developed land is land which is or was occupied by a permanent structure, including the curtilage of the developed land and any associated fixed surface infrastructure. So based on that, we are accepting that it is previously developed land. So just turning to the actual proposal, the application is for asking for temporary use for 3 years. The parking will be contained within the site. There's sufficient distance from the highway to allow for cars to enter the site, rotate and move around the site, wait for the car washing to be available. There's visitor parking, staff parking available as well, and the applicant has said that it will not affect the existing running of the visitor car park in terms of the nursery. Just turning to actually I'll just point out the protected trees at the south boundary here. The tree officer has had some concerns about the position of the car wash, but there is a condition which would secure an arboricultural method statement, and any details would be considered during the discharge of conditions stage. And then turning to the actual canopies, 2 canopies are proposed. We've got the washing area, which would have, I think it was described as a plastic canopy. There is a condition which is proposing for the sides of the car wash to also be enclosed with the canopy, and this would help in terms of spray and noise and sort of the general use of the site. Sorry. So just in conclusion, the application would be close to the south boundary. In terms of the openness of the green belt, it would be positioned a significant distance from the street scene. It would be behind a bund which is existing on the site, and landscaping. So as such, it's concluded that the application would not materially harm the openness of the green belt, and is therefore recommended for approval. Thank you.
Chairman, can I just add to my colleague's presentation just one further image, just to help you visualise and put the context of having seen it washed over with green belt and having heard it's previously developed land within the green belt. I just feel that that image helps you appreciate the nature of the site, the previously developed nature of the site, better than the plans. Thank you, Chairman.
Sorry, Chairman. Just while we have that picture up, could you just use your indicator on that, because that's quite a good.
Oh, it's going to be, yeah, sorry, Chris, I'm pointing at you. It's just down here on the southern boundary here. Then, excuse me?
Neighbouring properties.
Oh, this one here would be the closest property. And sorry, I should have spelt that out in my presentation. There's a distance of about well, at least 20 metres between there and the boundary.
I believe we're having one person speaking in objection today. Sharon Green.
Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Green, representing the Oaks Action Group, which opposes this application. Merley neighbours have seen the Oaks deteriorate from an attractive garden centre into a chaotic shambles where very few plants are sold, a state which has speeded up exponentially since the car lot appeared at the beginning of 2018. You have one proposal in front of you today, but another retrospective one about the car sales comes up next month. It's very difficult and disappointing to understand why this is not on today's agenda, as the two businesses are clearly linked. There are other vehicle-related operations on the site, none of which has applied for planning permission. From day to day, we don't know what will pop up there. The council does not act against these other businesses, claiming that any enforcement could prejudice any planning application sometime in an unspecified future. The message is clear: start a business, and the council will leave you alone. Today's recommendation gives you absolutely no idea of what is actually going on the site. We have complained until we are blue in the face about noise from machine tools and revving engines, notably double-decker buses lately, pollution, traffic problems, working in the evenings and on Sundays at the scaffolding business, piles of vermin attracting rubbish, piles of tyres, dead refrigerators, discharge of chemicals from the car wash, which is already up and running. It's washing the cars for sale on the car lots. Branches have been cut down from protected trees, and one of my neighbours who owns a strip of land running along the back of the garden centre discovered two gentlemen having a pee on her property when walking her dogs. So there's discharge from chemicals from the car wash. Nothing has been done about dealing with the effluent. The Oaks has only ever applied retrospectively, and the Borough of Poole, it seems to me, has always granted retrospective permission for whatever happens on that site. Only A1 retail use is permitted on certain parts of this green belt site. Businesses related to cars, vans and buses are not permitted except in exceptional circumstances. How can a car wash ever qualify as an exceptional circumstance, especially when there's one down the road in Soapers Lane? The enforcement officer, Mr. Deering, has told us that it is not in the public interest to enforce planning law. This does not mean in the interest of the public who've been living there for decades. The logic is, it seems to be more about the public purse. The logic is, don't ever enforce anything at all as it will cost money. Why do we have an enforcement officer if he's not allowed to do his job? It appears to us that there's a certain amount of bad faith going on. Dr. McCall of 65 Gravel Hill and I visited Planning Officer Mr. Genge on March the 11th. He told us the reason the applications were taking so long to deal with was because he was trying to make sure that no car business would ever get planning permission at the Oaks, thereby setting a precedent that this was a very complex result to achieve. We expressed our gratitude to him. Imagine our sense of betrayal when we read that this application is recommended for approval. What on earth is going on? There are people from Eastern Europe living on this Greenbelt site and apparently operating the car wash. My husband Peter visited one gentleman late one night when his music was very loud. The gentleman said he was called Magic and he was from Poland. He was very apologetic. He was polite. He was pleasant. He turned his music down. When we met Magic on a site visit, he pretended not to know my husband. But his demeanour was in sharp contrast to those of other somewhat threatening migrants who threw a group of residents and councillors out that day. How come anyone is living there anyway? A certificate of lawlessness was issued for one person to live on the site. We say that the Borough of Poole was duped in issuing it. An affidavit signed by someone living in Wales of whom we'd never heard claimed that can I just have another couple of minutes? That Mr. Nutting had been living on site for several years. We don't believe that. When I asked Mr. Genge why someone living in another country could give an opinion on the matter.
Okay, that's going to have to be enough.
We ask you to not only refuse this application, but to look into the site as a whole. Thank you.
I believe there's no applicants or supporters speaking today, but the ward councillors do wish to speak. Okay. Just want to remind you that you get 5 minutes each as ward councillors.
Thank you very much. That makes things slightly easier. I'm one of the 3 ward councillors for Bearwood and Merley. One of us can't attend today because he has other engagements, but I'm speaking on his behalf as well. So first of all, I'd like to object to this planning permission. I'm also quite disappointed that it hasn't come to the committee with the application for the car sales on the same site, because I do feel that they have significant interactions with each other. That also a site visit wasn't granted because I feel that you could actually see what was going on there with more detail. The site is one of the main concerns for people of Merley, particularly on that side of Merley because of what has been going on there. Residents have asked me to remind you that it is Greenbelt, even though it is previously developed. Previous development seems to have happened accidentally rather than following Poole planning objectives due to other factors beyond Poole planning control. Residents will be a lot happier if there was a clear shared vision for the site rather than this ad hoc planning applications that seem to be going on at the moment. Residents don't understand how land which is Greenbelt can be developed from a small garden centre into what is becoming an industrial estate or possibly worse. Previous development was accepted for retail use, but this is not actually retail, it's a service industry. The car wash will also encourage a lot more people to be driving on land, which is the green belt, because you have to actually drive across green belt land to get to it. If the committee is minded to grant consent, we feel that there's a few conditions that could do with tightening up. Reference to the opening hours. At the moment, the garden centre is open on Sundays from 10 till 4, not 9 till 5. And at the moment, there's nothing in the conditions about opening on Christmas Day or Easter or any other public holidays. It's also been clear that if it is granted, that that the actual washing should finish at the time when it closes, rather than what residents are concerned of is that if the car sales do continue there, that the gates might be closed. However, they might be contracted to wash cars for other people behind closed gates at any time of the day or night. Also, it's noted that the application is for a car wash and drying only. No valeting has been asked for on the site, and people are concerned that if car wash was allowed, that car valeting might also happen using loud vacuum cleaners. And also notice that nothing's been asked for car repairs or maintenance. I think that should be put in, however minor they would be. Also, as a noise issue has annoyed quite a few people. If application was allowed, could something be put in to stop the playing of loud music or other entertainment, electronically amplified, because over the sound of the car washing, that would actually make it a lot more difficult. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to add to what my colleague has said, I think if members have read the report, then they'll be clear that there's complex planning history on this site, and certainly, it started to be something quite different to what it started out as a garden centre and a nursery. The site designation, as described in the report in paragraph 15, is previously developed land in the green belt. There are a number of established uses on the site, as detailed in the report in paragraphs 24 to 27, which details the legal position. Because of the legal position and these different uses, I know it's been quite a difficult application process. While I agree with much of what the case officer says in the report, I also agree with the concerns raised by objectors and by my ward colleagues. Just to clarify that although car sales has been mentioned and one of the pictures showed a number of cars on the site for sale, that use does not have planning permission at the moment, and there is an application for that which will come to committee at some point in the future. So I wouldn't want members to think, oh well, look, there's lots of cars on the site anyway, so what's the problem with a car wash? That does not have planning permission at the moment. There was enforcement action which has forced them to go down the planning route. I'd say to councillors that a lot of councillors here are likely to have car washes in their wards and experience the sort of the way those are used and the type of activities and the noise and disturbance that causes. And I would just say, do you think that is appropriate for a sensitive greenbelt site close to protected trees? For me, the key consideration here is the conclusion in the report that the proposal would not lead to additional harm to the openness of the greenbelt, and particularly where it talks about the National Planning Policy Framework in paragraphs 31 to 34. I would argue that this proposal would be harmful to the openness of the greenbelt for a number of reasons, due to the structures that are proposed to be erected on site, due to the proximity to a number of protected trees, due to the increase in regular vehicle movements around the site and on and off of the site and through the site, due to the introduction of a service business in what is predominantly a retail sales site, and that would a service business that would have regular vehicle movements throughout the period that it's open, and also because in my view it just represents further creeping industrialisation of the greenbelt in this area. And as such, I would urge members to refuse this application in line with paragraph 133 of the National Planning Policy Framework mentioned in your reports, and that because I think this is an inappropriate development which is harmful to the greenbelt, and urge them to refuse it on that basis. If they decide to go against that and decide to approve it, I would draw their attention to the representation by my colleague Councillor Marcus Andrews, detailed in the addendum sheet, and the conditions that he details there. But I would urge members to refuse it on the grounds that it's inappropriate development in the green belt.
Does anybody wish to start the debate? Councillor Stribley.
Sorry, and I must remember to switch myself on. I know the site well. I've known it for over 40 years. For 30 years, I lived in the lane to the south of the site, Blackwater Drive, but not adjacent to the site, coming further down towards Arrowsmith Road for the people who know the area. I lived there in the 80s when the whole area was made green belt, and I chaired the planning committee until 1991 and was still a member of the committee when this was granted permission as an appropriate development for a garden centre in the green belt, there being still a greenhouse and a couple of sheds on the site. But that was to the western end of the site where they remain now. And there was even some conjecture when, first of all, an ancillary business, which was a lawnmower and such repairer, came on site, but of course that was also appropriate to a garden centre. So that was acceptable, and then it developed slightly in that you could get gravel and paving slabs on the site and so on, and latterly you can go and buy a conservatory there apparently. But the rest of the site, the rear of the site and the whole of the eastern end was in effect an open paddock. There used to be plants set out in the open air for sale. A lot of the area was occasionally, not often, but for a while they grew vegetables, lettuce and so on the site. But most of the site remained just open and barren. I can't believe this committee didn't choose to site visit, because it is talking about harm to the openness of the green belt is just ludicrous. I have had arguments with Pool's planning department over many years on this as the development crept along, and ex-neighbours up in the area would say, oh, you're on the planning committee, can you have a word about it? And so sometimes I did, usually notifying the local councillor at the same time. The site must have 200 or 300 or more cars across it at the moment. Most of it's been turned into hard standing. The scaffolding site was given a temporary permission without the neighbours being notified. There are people living on the site, not just in the caravan, which somehow got permission for one security person to be there on site. There are huts at the rear boundary of the site that are lived in. And again, the planning department and the enforcement department have turned a totally blind eye to that over several years. And of course, and I can't tell you how many little repair chaps there are. There's one here, one there, another one round the corner. You wouldn't believe it unless you visited the site. It is a green belt site. It should remain a green belt site. You have to drive to this proposed development. You have to drive right into the site, near to the rear of the site, 60 feet we've heard from a dwelling. And prior to it being green belted, to develop in that area, you had to have 5 acres to put one house on. And one property in the adjacent Blackwater Drive, an ancient, or rather tatty 1920s 30 two-bedroom bungalow, could only, which wanted to expand into a reasonable house because it sits on 10 acres, was granted permission to only expand by 10% because it would be damaging the openness of the green belt. I just think this is horrendous. I cannot believe it's even being considered without it being visited by every member of this committee and having a careful tour. And I personally would recommend refusal on just about every ground you can think of.
Does any other member wish? Councillor No.
Yeah, I'd just like to endorse what Councillor Stribley has said. I've visited this site in the last 2 weeks on 3 occasions, and of all the planning that has come before us, this one was the most troubling. And I did look into the history. I did walk the site. I think previous management has been remiss at not enforcing the requirements of the site. Questions about the amount of vehicles on site, bearing in mind it might increase. There is a sales area, but at the back of the site there are numerous vehicles stored. They're either waiting for sale or for refurbishment prior to sale. In addition to that, in walking the site, I note that the area is unsafe. There are a number of loosely stored pallets, oil drums and other waste around the site.
And gas cylinders.
Yeah, gas cylinders. And my recommendation is to refuse the application on the basis that we shouldn't compound it with the existing situation that should also be refused.
Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I too endorse everything I've just heard. I have visited the site, and frankly, I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked that this site, with the legislation that we have nowadays, and the powers that we have, has been allowed to develop in the way that it has. I agree that there are dangers on the site. I've witnessed the things that have been described. In particular, I was concerned about what appeared to be probably fuel or diesel storage in large containers. Well, I can't prove that, but that's what it appeared to be. Yeah, I was absolutely shocked that this could happen, and wondered how enforcement could not, because there is a whole range of businesses going on in there. Now, to say this is previously developed land on the basis of it being a nursery, well, I can understand that in the green belt, as Councillor Stribley said, but actually that is not what you have there now, and all these other things have grown on because of the assumption that it was previously developed land. But I do question the usage. Now, even if you accept that the nursery is still there and the primary visit there, and a purpose of the use of the site, and I don't accept that now actually, but that was A1 retail use. Now, the car wash, it seems to me unlikely that it would be used on a commercial basis for the public to come in and travel all the way up to the end of that lane and then park amongst all the scrap that's there to have the car washed. So immediately you have to draw the conclusion, well, the car washing is probably there primarily for all the cars that are being stored there and worked on, probably without planning consent at the moment. But assuming it was a commercial car wash and open for the public, what would the use of that be in terms of the approved use of the site? Would that be a retail business?
I wouldn't describe it as an A1 retail use. I would describe it as a car wash. It's potentially sui generis. But I would like to just draw attention. The applicant is a different person to the applicant on the car sales. Our understanding is it's not directly associated with the car sales. It is a standalone car wash proposal. Thank you, Chairman.
So in that case, then we're just concentrating on the use, regardless of who the applicant is. Does the use of a car wash here fit with the currently approved use of an A1 retail site?
John, I don't think that's the point. It is a previously developed site, and other uses or redevelopment is appropriate development on this site. If it came forward for other uses, we would consider them. Were this building in the green belt, or this proposed building in the green belt, and not on a previously developed site, it would be inappropriate development. By being on a site that is clearly previously developed land, it has lawful use as retail. By being previously developed land, it's no longer inappropriate development. You still need to make the same judgments about the nature of the development, but it's no longer, if you like, failing at the first hurdle by being inappropriate development.
Sorry, can I carry on, Chair? Sorry,
Councillor Stribley.
Yes, Chairman, I do have to challenge that, as I in fact challenged it when the planning department for some reason suddenly gave retail use on the site. You had a garden centre, with ancillary services, lawnmower repairs, gravel, paving, etc. And because of that, they'd put up some extra wooden buildings. And then a hairdresser popped in there. I don't really think that's useful for, or usual in a garden centre. You wouldn't find it at Haskins or Stewart's or any of the other large ones in the area. But the excuse was then, oh well, they're selling plants and stuff in the garden centre, so it's retail and you can have that in a retail area. And to me, the rest of the site was never used for anything. It was open paddock land until it started to be covered by cars. It started to have all sorts of heavy equipment dumped on it. It started to have, there are gas cylinders about, there are fuel tanks about, there are endless cars, some of which will probably never move again unless they're dragged off on a trailer. To how you can say it was previously developed land as a garden centre market garden. It was never a previously developed retail site. And I think the planning office in Poole has been very remiss over this issue for a number of years, and it really is time it was sorted out.
Chairman, if I perhaps just clarify. The statement's been made a couple of times that the planning authority approved the retail use. I think the key words along the top of the drawing there on your screens is that it was a lawful development certificate. They demonstrated that its existing use was as a garden centre. It's one of those sites that many authorities have, which starts off as a small holding, perhaps a paddock, it merges into, they start growing plants, they start selling a few plants, a few plants becomes, and a few lawnmowers and garden tools. And by the time in the early 90s when this application was made, the boundary of the site, the green edge there, was demonstrated as being A1 retail use. It wasn't demonstrated as being a garden centre or a nursery, or it was an A1 retail use. That was the use within which it fell. So I think there was not, if you like, a judgment required on the merits of it. It was whether they had demonstrated that this was the curtilage of the site. And I think we're revisiting ancient history because we're looking at something that was established back in the early 90s.
Time considerably later than that.
Chairman, the garden centre is an A1 use.
Does anybody else wish to speak on this? Councillor Barron.
Yes, I'm not at all surprised that the tree officer was a little bit concerned, because when I visited the site today I saw that somebody's already started packing branches off the old oak trees. Can we get the aerial map up? So you can see that row of oaks is probably an old hedgerow, an old HMO, and I understand that the enforcement officer wouldn't take any action against them because they didn't actually catch somebody with the saw in their hand. But I think it's very unlikely that somebody left Queen Anne Drive in the middle of the night, came down here and was so sort of desperate for firewood that they picked on those trees as opposed to going in the middle of Delft Woods or something. And regarding the trees' protection, I think there's an unacceptable risk of the spray from the chemicals, because they'll put the degreaser on the cars and they'll use a pressure washer, and that drift can get taken into the hedgerow. the terms that, you know, the conditions that have been put down by the tree officer, it's just a copy and paste standard terms for any development site. Just protect the trees with scaffolding such a distance. There's no mention whatsoever of, you know, chemical storage after the proposed is built, what chemicals they're going to be using. I really do fear for the habitat through there. I really do. I mean, oaks house such a broad spectrum of wildlife, and to be, you know, to have that spray drift on them on a daily basis, all the insects, all the bats, everything, the leaves, it's going to soak into the leaves, as if it's a big backpack sprayer. I just, I'm very, very uncomfortable with it indeed.
Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So it seems to me that the planning officers are constrained by the approvals and planning consents that are already applying to the site, and the fact that the site is recognised as a previously developed land, albeit for a garden centre. But the problem is here that you cannot look at this proposed operation in isolation. You've got to look at it in context of what's actually happening on the site. And you have to ask yourself, I guess, that if we were to approve the application, would the harm that's already being exerted across the site be exacerbated? Or would it make no difference? Or would it improve it? You know, it's very difficult just to think about the car wash as in isolation, and I think it's only right that you actually do consider it in the context of what's going on there. And whilst I understand the difficulties the planning officer has because of the constraints I think that they feel that they're under, I personally believe that this would add more harm to what's happening on the site. Now, I'm not quite sure in terms of material planning objections what I can hang that on, but and it may be that if you are looking at it in the context of what's happening there, you do need to account, although it's a different applicant, you do need to account for the other application for the car businesses that are running there, which is yet to come before, because I think there is undoubtedly some kind of link between the two. So I'm almost at the point of saying, well, actually you can't actually make a decision on this particular application without taking those other issues into context, including the application that has been tabled for use of the site as a car business. And although they're separate applications, I believe there is an implication between the two. And on that basis, I would suggest that we actually defer this decision until we've heard the other application. It's just a suggestion. I'm not proposing it at this point, but I just throw that on the table for discussion.
Chairman, if I could just come back in, I mean, the mood around the table is apparent. Let me just perhaps clarify a few things and give a few pointers to the committee to help them in their deliberations. When it comes to green belt and previously developed land, the National Planning Policy Framework goes to the heart of this. It's something that we go straight back to the MPPF rather than the plans. Let me remind you so that you are clear about what's before you for consideration. MPPF, proposals affecting the green belt. A local planning authority should regard the construction of new buildings as inappropriate in the green belt. Exceptions to this are, and there is a list which includes limited infilling or the partial or complete redevelopment of previously developed land, which this is, whether redundant or in continuing use, excluding temporary buildings, which would not have a greater impact on the openness of the green belt than the existing development. Therefore, the question you have to ask yourself is the development before you today, not the entirety of the site, not all of the many unauthorised uses and activities and the piles of rubbish that we've seen the photographs of, which are clearly unacceptable, but would the development before you today have a greater impact on the openness of the green belt than the existing development within the site? You also have to deal with the development before you today. You've heard suggestions about storage of materials, you've heard suggestions about unauthorised occupation of the site. Enforcement, contrary to what we've heard, is engaging on a very regular basis with this site, The police have been involved. There's been so far accusations of modern slavery, prostitution, unauthorised uses, illegal uses, all sorts of things have been suggested. But at the end of the day, you are dealing with a planning application for a 15 metre by 5 metre concrete slab with 2 canopies on it to allow cars to be washed. The separation distance, what my colleague might have misspoken earlier on in terms of, if I can just highlight a couple of distances, the position of the proposed car wash slab is there. The nearest dwelling to the south is there, in excess of 70 metres away from that. Similarly, the nearest dwelling to the west, the actual house, is 70 metres away. I think my colleague may have misspoken 20 metres, which was the reference to these storage and workshop buildings within the curtilage of this house. It's not retrospective. The building isn't there, the slab isn't there. Those of you who have seen the site, I believe some car washing has gone on associated with the car sale site, but this is a standalone application for a car wash. And I would encourage you and urge you not to seek to penalise the applicant putting forward, seeking to get planning permission for a proposed use on this site, not to penalise them because of the other activities that possibly they may have something to do with them, but other persons have introduced on the site or carrying out on the site, to withhold planning permission for a properly made application for use. You may feel the use is inappropriate. You can express a judgment on that, but you should not seek to penalise this applicant in this development because of other unlawful development that clearly is already acting on the site. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Stribley.
Sorry, Chairman, to come back again. I'd like to formally propose that the application is refused as inappropriate in the green belt, and I would also ask this committee to either instruct or urge the planning authority to take enforcement action against all unauthorised activities acknowledged and outlined by the senior planning officer just now that are on this site. It has gone on for years and it is a total disgrace, and it is to the shame of Poole's planning department, which I used to be extremely proud.
Councillor Stribley, I would happily second that from the chair. Councillor Hilliard, did you want to come in quickly before we go to the vote?
I was going to support the refusal on the grounds of 143, because I think we're talking about the canopy, but there will also be storage for the chemicals. There will also be somewhere for the workers to sit while they're waiting, or the customers to sit while they're waiting. So it's not going to be one structure. It will impact the openness.
Let's take this to the vote then. All.
Before taking the vote, can I just clarify? So the proposal that it be refused as inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, can I caution that it's by definition not inappropriate development? You may think it's unacceptable development. That's not the same as inappropriate development. By definition, buildings on previously developed land of this kind are not inappropriate unless, and this is the bit you need to set out, unless it will have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt than the existing development. And I would suggest that that's actually what you're saying, that it will have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt than the existing development on the site, which brings it back in within the realms of the NPPF.
Councillor Porviden.
Thank you.
Sorry, I missed that.
I think that is exactly the relevant point, because what is proposed is a structure that does not replace an existing structure at that point. There is nothing basically at that point. It was described as car parking area. I wasn't exactly sure of the location of the concrete slab, but most of that, the area that appears to be where the concrete slab will go, you couldn't even park a car on now because it's overgrown and there's rubbish around. But it's certainly not built on. There are no structures there as such. But so to build the canopies, the concrete slab is additional building. It's not replacing anything that's there. The only point I could say in its favour, anything there, is that it might marginally improve the area. I mean, clearly an awful lot needs to be done. I was absolutely shocked when I went in there to describe it as a garden centre and nursery. I mean, nursery suggests raising plants probably from seed, nothing of that going on. I wouldn't have thought any self-respecting gardener would be seen near there, except I did, when I was there, actually see a chap buying a bag of compost. So obviously some gardeners do frequent it, but I mean, to call it a garden centre is a joke, and it's an absolute disgrace. Previous speakers have highlighted the rubbish, the dangers. I would imagine if this application was coming on a similar site that wasn't in the green belt, we would not accept it. So why would we accept it in the green belt?
Chairman, can I in addition, I've heard several members of the committee speak about concerns about harm to the adjacent preserved trees from drainage of effluent and from spray, and I think, again, if we could, I'd suggest that may form part of your proposal.
Councillor Stribley, are you happy for your proposal to be amended?
I'm happy for anything to be added to it, providing it doesn't provide a let-out at some point. If we're strengthening our ecosystem, then I am content. But I also, part of my proposal is to urge the planning authority to take enforcement action against all unauthorised activities on the site.
For the sake of clarification, would the planning officer...
Chairman, it wouldn't normally be a function of this committee to make that judgment. Clearly, it is a site which the enforcement team and senior officers of the council have been engaged with for a number of months, if not years, in seeking to remedy some very, very complicated land ownership and land use, well, land uses on the site. I think I would be content to take the message away from this committee that there is serious concern amongst members of the committee about the current state of affairs at the site, but I would urge you not to formally resolve to take action at this point. That is a matter that needs, I'd suggest, further deliberation and consideration.
Happy to modify that as long as we can have a full report back within the next 2 months on it, because it is beyond a joke the time this has been going on and the time that past councillors in the area have been chasing this issue. I know Councillor Marion Pope was there. She absolutely fought over this one, and it's been like banging heads on walls, and it's time other heads got banged.
Councillor Hilliard.
I think that sounds to be taken forward to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee rather than this committee to look into that.
Chairman, can I remind you also there is, of course, 2 other outstanding planning applications on the site, one of which is the unauthorised car sales on the frontage, which is the subject of a separate application, and it's anticipated, although it's not quite there yet, it's anticipated that will be brought to committee soon, probably the next meeting of this committee. So I'd suggest that to step back from that at the moment, to await rather than prejudge the outcome of the other planning application that will be brought to you in the fullness of time.
So if we take Councillor Stribley's proposal to the vote, with me seconding, is that everybody for?
That appears to be unanimous, Chair.
Thank you very much.